Authenticity at its core for me means living a life that I don't want to escape from. And I have to give credit. This wasn't my idea. I had read this in larger conversations talking around, self care and really valuing your existence, so to speak. But when I thought about this question, since we started talking about the podcast, and that's what I kind of got down to, that's what it is, right? That I'm living a life that I'm proud of, that I can look myself in the eye and look the people that I love in the eye and say, this is me. I showed up as who I meant to be and who I want to be.
That's deep. That's deep. Tell me about the time when you weren't living that life, though. When were you living a life that you wanted to escape?
Absolutely. Well, first let me start. I think it's a continuum, right? I
Mm,
think that there are pieces in my life right now that I look at and I think I don't like this. I'm not comfortable here. Something needs to change, right? So that it's not like a finish line. You don't, it's a lot of pressure to put on yourself to say, like, hey, I've arrived, because there's always like life is messy. I'm a mess all the time, right? And so to say
everybody.
that to say that, that it's going to be a point where it's all over, I think is not realistic. But a point where I felt like, yeah, where I wasn't authentic. I mean, I can point to a few parts of my life that felt that way. I think the biggest milestones, and it's weird to think about it this way, but I had just had my second child. Um, I had my kids 24 months apart, and I went back to work 3 days a week. Everything was flexible, things were moving along. Um, but I my husband had a job out of state, and so he was commuting pretty long hours. I was doing the childcare gig by myself. I was trying to support a 30 to 40% travel schedule, which meant on those days, like my husband kind of had to tap in, which there's a lot of reasons why he had to take a job out of state. And that's another podcast. Um, but I was I was trying to live up to the expectations of being a parent, being a wife, and being a rock star employee. And I didn't take time to listen to that voice that said, is this what we're doing now? Like, oh, okay, so we're just forgetting what we need in this equation and putting all of our focus on the kids and the career and none of it on like how we're doing, and that hit in your stomach when you wake up every day that you're not really killing it in any way. You're just surviving. um I lasted for about 7 months after I went back to work because I was burnt out and I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror, and it was really hard because I'd been working since I was 9, right? Like my
Yeah,
first job was going with my mom to the houses that she cleaned and doing odd and end jobs that I had been doing. And I've never stopped working since then. So to all of a sudden turn around and say, I don't want to work anymore. I want to stay home with my kids
mm,
and I want to just slow my life down. It felt like someone had just thrown a glass of ice water in my face. It was such a shock to have that experience. But when I look back on it, it's because I wasn't being true to what I needed in the moment. I wasn't saying, I can't travel 40% anymore, or we have the wrong childcare setup, or, hey, I think you should look for a job closer to the city. Whatever that was, I wasn't, that voice, that authentic voice wasn't showing up. And it led to some pretty big transitions and milestones in my life. I don't regret that it happened. I do wish that I had listened to that voice because it was there all along, but I just thought, well, I can do a little bit more, right? Like, come on, I'm a first generation immigrant. Like, my parents, they went through hell and back for me to get here. I can do this. I can make it through this really lovely corporate job and like life with two children and like full-time childcare. I can push through this. And there just came a point where that wasn't the answer anymore, right? Pushing through wasn't the answer. Stopping and being vulnerable and saying I need help was the answer. And I just completely ignored that. And what a life lesson that was, to be able to say you don't have to have it figured out in the way that you see other people figuring it out. Like, you can make those answers work for you
Yeah.
And it's something that I've kind of carried with me in terms of what I've done since then.
That's a powerful life-changing experience. And I had one similar. It was during the pandemic, actually. And a few things that stuck out to me when you were sharing that experience was one, just expectations, right? And my
Mhm.
mind instantly went to, wait, whose expectations? Like, did someone tell you that you had to do all that? Or was it
Yeah.
you telling yourself that you had to do all that? And I remember during the pandemic, I remember going through like a performance review, like a mid-year check-in for my performance review. And my manager was like, well, you know what, if you want to get promoted and exceed expectations, like you got to do this and that. And it was the first time I told her,
Mm.
oh, no, I think there's a disconnect here. I don't want to exceed expectations.
Yeah.
But even telling myself that and telling my manager that, like being comfortable with not wanting to exceed expectations was so difficult for me.
Mhm.
But
And
I
did
had
you
to,
feel like physically uncomfortable when you said that?
oh, 100%. I felt like I needed that validation to tell myself that I was doing a good job
Mm.
and I was on the road to something bigger. But like I had to stop and think, like, why do I even want something bigger? Like I'm very comfortable where I am now. And like, you know what? Maybe that'll change in a few months, but right now, I don't want to do that. Right. Maybe I want to exceed expectations in the next month or 2 months, but right now, I think it's okay to accept that I don't need to want more. And I feel like corporate has a funny way of making you feel like you should always be striving for more.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I think going back to your expectation thing is like, no one told me that I should be chasing that. Like I was telling myself, I was putting that pressure on myself. I'm curious for you, like, were you also putting that pressure on yourself or were people telling you, what are you doing? You could do all this.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both, but honestly, the voice that I listened to was the voice I was telling myself of like,
Mm,
"Hey, you know, so and so over there just got back from maternity leave with their kids and they've got it all figured out, right?" That's sometimes I catch myself still doing it when I make an assumption that someone's got it all figured out. And then I realize, I bet if I, kind of looked under the hood, started pulling back those layers, that no, that's not the case, and reminding myself that that's not always there. So the expectations that I'm setting are under false pretenses.
mm.
That those aren't there, right? But there's also something to be said, I think, and this is something that still hits me very much is my parents came here to build a new life and they left behind a pretty good, pretty cushy life to work in manual labor jobs and really be at a certain point of the socioeconomic ladder so that I could then advance as far as I needed to go, right? That was, and I still very much have this mindset and I have to balance it out that I only have this short amount of time to go as far as I can go to create a different stability for my family, to create a different socioeconomic place for my family. And I'm talking about my family, meaning my kids, so my future generations and my past generations, like taking care of my parents and also ensuring that my kids have at least the same socioeconomic level that I do, right? And so that always kind of fueled the drive to say, you have this opportunity now, you got to like run the hell out of it. And that expectation comes at a price. It always had, but I was willing to pay it. When now you add a layer of being a parent on top of that, I was like, this isn't going to slow me down. I'll be fine. My expectation was that I could do the job and be the parent all at the same time. And that wasn't the case. And I found out very quickly that that wasn't the case, but the expectation was that, yeah, that's what was going to happen. And on your comment, like, who are you exceeding expectations for? For your company that's going to make more profit and you're going to be stuck in a mental health crisis, right? Like, I wonder about that. Like I'm the kind of person that I will always do well in my job. I will always, meaning that I will always do things to the best of my ability. But that extra little 10-20% that takes to go to exceeding expectations, I want to be in control of that. I want to be able to put that in reference with the rest of my life to say, I'm able to exceed expectations because project really interests me. Maybe it's a request from the team that I'm working with to say, hey, we got to like really work on this. But there are going to be times when I'm going to sit back and be like, hey, you know what? Work, you don't get that extra exceeding expectations. I got to go exceed expectations in like the menu that I want to put together for my friend's birthday party back when we used to have like live birthday parties, but like that, those are the sort of things that I want to be in control of. I want to now know and understand and want to put my energy in these places. And
Yeah.
that's hard. It's hard
It
to
is really
say to
difficult.
yourself.
With all that pressure, right? And I'm getting chills when you said, thinking back to when you said, I not only have to think about family in my kids, but also my previous generation, right? The family. I'm curious, what were some of those emotions that came up for you when you made the decision to leave your job and prioritize or focus or dedicate more time to your family? So essentially stepping away
Mhm.
from working and being a full-time parent.
One of the biggest ones was the guilt that I had in stepping away from my career in a way that my parents never had the luxury to do.
It
And
is a luxury
it is absolutely a
to
luxury.
stop working, and yeah, yeah.
Mhm. I say that fully knowing that for many of my friends, going back to work wasn't a luxury because childcare costs were so high that
Yeah.
it was actually an economic choice for survival, right? And those choices are real and exist on a day-to-day level. For me, it was, hey, I in a place where this no longer makes sense for me, I'm going to step away. So the big one was guilt, right? That my mother specifically didn't have this choice because it was a paycheck to paycheck situation for a lot of the times, right? And the second piece was this thought of, if I don't work, then who am I? Like, if I don't have this piece to anchor me, then what am I doing? How am I going to spend my time? I'm supposed to be on this like up and up, right? Like, what's next? What's next? What's next? It doesn't exist when you stay home with your kids in the same way.
Mhm.
What's next is like, are we practicing learning how to read? Are we, thinking about eating healthy meals 3 times a day? And getting off of that hamster wheel was just a huge identity shift to
It's
be
just
able to say,
so much of your identity is tied to your job and your
so
title.
much
Yeah.
of it,
Yeah.
so much of it. Yeah. Yeah. I put up a post on LinkedIn a while ago that like there was an article that said like loving your job is a capitalist trap. And it was very interesting, and it resonated with me because after that experience of leaving that job, when I approached the workforce again and came back to higher ed, I approached it with, this is not the center or the core of my identity anymore. So I want to pick a job that lets me do the things that I really enjoy doing and that's going to push me in ways that are healthy, but it's not the core of who I am. I get to do really cool things and I really love the people that I work with. Like, I enjoy them sincerely, but yeah, it's not this major theme in my life.
I'm assuming one of the emotions that you had during that time had to be fear, right? Because fear of the unknown, fear of like, if I did want to go back into the workforce, if and when would they want me? What would they say about the
Mhm.
potential gap in my resume? Like, did those thoughts come up, and was that a reality?
In part it was, for better, for worse. I've always been pretty confident that I'm like good at what I do and have gotten that like feedback throughout the years. So I sort of walked into it and thought like, oh, when I'm ready, I'm gonna just say that I'm ready and I'm just gonna do it, right? Like, it's just gonna happen. It wasn't until I actually started applying for jobs when I was ready to go back into the workforce that I thought like, hey, why isn't anyone picking up my resume? This is interesting. I have direct experience. It's been 4 years ago, but I've kept up with the industry. I've kept up with my network. Not much has changed. So what's going on here? And I sort of did that thing where you just send out resumes and see what happens. When I wasn't getting any hits, then I jumped into my network and rallied the troops and did the thing that all the wise career advisors tell you to do, and that's when things started picking up for sure. But I think the fear was more about losing my salary, not earning dollars coming in, and you definitely lose some freedom in that, right? You lose some ability to choose. But I wasn't so worried about being out of the marketplace too much. And I think part of that is because I'm in an industry, prior to that, I was in D&I recruiting that doesn't tend to evolve as rapidly as like tech or other sectors. So I think that was also a piece of it.
Yeah. Well, didn't you say the ironic part, I think, was that when you were working, there were companies that were actively recruiting you and like, oh my God, if you want to work
Yes.
here, just let me know. And they were like sliding your
Yes.
DMs. Yet when when you applied back to them, it was like crickets. It was like, wait,
Who's
what?
this?
You
Yeah.
were just yeah.
Who's this? Oh, it totally was. Yeah, it totally was. And it's funny now that I think about it because I'm like, look, I became the best manager when I was at home. When I was working with my kids, like if you can potty train a toddler, you can manage through a lot of things in your life, including your teams. Like there is such value in that. And then I think, I look at resumes all day long. So when I see, especially in the pandemic, when someone's had to take time out of their work or they have a gap on their resume, I approach that now with such a different lens than when I did before, because there's so many reasons that everyone takes a break from work, whether it was voluntary or involuntary, right? There's so many pieces and so many stories behind all of that.
Yeah, I think the pandemic helped in that regard where I don't think it's just you. I think a lot of people now empathize with so many things that they wouldn't have before. Like I think so many people would have questioned gaps on the resumes. And now people that are reviewing resumes is like, oh, you know what? Those 6 months into Loom, I took that time off.
Yeah.
Now I understand
Right.
why someone else took time off. Or for other reasons that aren't as fun, health related issues and and
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how do we create recruiting systems that allow the space for those things, and can see them as benefits to having this kind of candidate come to you?
Yeah. I'm curious now in your role or even these days, right? You said obviously it's a continuous journey. We're all working through it. But now, these days, do you feel a bit more comfortable in bringing your most authentic self to work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say absolutely yes. What I've learned about myself over the years is that my authenticity is wrapped up with my vulnerability. They're really twins in that space. And in order to be authentic, I have to be vulnerable in what's happening. I think coming up, you didn't see a lot of leaders say like, "Hey, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just figuring it out," or this is new to me. I'm on a learning curve. And I don't know if it was just the folks that I had in front of me, or my sense is that, and even now, it's just not something that's always spoken about. And so as a younger employee and staff member, I was like, oh my gosh, if you get to a certain level, like you have to have your stuff like neat and tied up and really in like this perfect package. And now I realize, oh, if that's the deal, I'm out. Like, I wouldn't have survived very long. And so I do feel like I have an opportunity to be in that space much more. And I've carved out this area where, I can say the things that scare me at work are the things that I actually probably should do. And to be able to say that, I recently went through a promotion cycle and was asked like, what are your thoughts about this new position? And I was like, I'm scared. Absolutely. I'm frightened. There's a lot of curves that I gotta like, the learning curves that I gotta go over, but it's the things that scare me the most that I have the most fun with. And I was able to
Same.
say that in the process. And it was like so refreshing and reassuring just to say, I don't know what's involved in what you're asking me to do, but I know that I'm willing to try. And your support in this process means the world to me, that I can stumble and know that it's okay. It's a part of the process. You're learning. And
What
to be able
gave
to reflect that to my team is really important too.
Yeah, I'm so curious. What gave you that confidence to be able to embrace those terrifying moments? Like, because you mentioned earlier, right? The representation that you saw previously was people not being vulnerable, maybe even like people avoiding some of those scary things. What was it for you that gave you that confidence?
That's a really good question. When I'm able to name that something is out of my wheelhouse or that I don't feel super confident in it, it also opens up space to be curious and to ask and to come at it as a student in some ways, like in that mind frame, versus, kind of walking in and saying, yeah, I've got this all figured out. Hit me with whatever questions that you have. There are definitely some pieces of my career and my professional skill set where I'm like, oh yeah, no, I got this, not to worry. But I found it really helpful to say, I'm starting from zero on this, so I'm gonna need some bandwidth to figure it out, and air cover too from the folks that I work with that are my leaders, to say, I'll get up to speed and I would really need some time, some support, some resources to get up there. And naming that in the beginning has allowed me to have that space. I mean, as the words came out of my mouth, I was like, should I be saying this to here now? But I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna see if it's something, yeah, that I can do. I think one of the experiences too that I had. So I started here at NYU Stern, and I was in a marketing role, and I had really great leaders, really great boss who said, "Have you ever thought about operations?" And I was like, "Never a day in my life, not even, never even consider it." And they're like, "Well, you sort of think like you have a systems mindset. Like I'm that person that like writes out their grocery store list in order of like the areas of the grocery store. Like I'm constantly organizing things, or one of my coworkers gave me a like maybe you should consider moving into operations." And I was like, "You're hilarious." And I took the risk, freaking love it. And they would not have done that if someone hadn't tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, go ahead and try this," right? You might actually be good at it. And so that experience of starting from zero as someone who had a decent amount of work experience underneath their belt was fascinating.
Yeah.
And I was scared the whole time I was doing it. And that amazing team that supported me. And that really made me think like, yeah, the scary stuff can actually be the really good stuff. One of the things I think made a huge difference was feeling safe.
Yeah. Speaking of feeling safe, I'm sure people that work with you or even report into you, you want to make them feel safe as well. And I think one of the dope things that you mentioned was something along the lines of like, it's really important for me to do this because people are watching, essentially. And I think that is so true. I'm curious, like in you being your most authentic self, or you being even vulnerable, have people said anything? For example, people, I'm sure, and maybe this is just me assuming, people will probably like, thanks for saying that. Like, I didn't want to share that I was struggling with this, and that, or that I was scared, but you gave me the confidence to do that.
I've been really fortunate to hear those words reflected back to me in this process of the vulnerability and the authenticity. I really do enjoy when I get to talk to someone who's junior and
Mm.
is trying to figure it out. I really do enjoy saying like, look, I didn't know anything about operations and I started from zero and got to a really good place because I had a great team. I had support, I had safety, I had resources, had a team that believed in me, in both directions, up and down. But I had no idea what I was doing. Like those first 3 months, my goodness, I was just trying to get my bearings. And so sharing that story, I hope allows some other folks to see that, you can continue to make strides and get to those great places without meeting every single qualification, and ticking every single box. Because if I had done that, I don't think I would have taken this journey and discovered that I really love this other area that I'd never even considered before. Um, and so I try to tell these stories as much as I can because I think so often, especially employees of color, but particularly women of color, we don't always go for the risky things. We don't always make the big jumps because, A, what if I fail? Right. And then like all the security that I've built just melts away. And I'm not ready for it. I only meet 5 of the 10, qualifications. I'm not ready for it. And I think in part we have to be okay with taking that leap. And we also have to push institutions to build in that safety so that we can take the leap, right? Whether that means support and training, mentorship, a senior leader who's got your back effectively and can give you that space and that bandwidth to do those risky things. Those institutions also need to be safe for the people taking the risks.
I agree. Someone said this on the podcast. I forget who, but essentially, you being your most authentic self gives someone else permission to do the same, right? Because they're like, oh, well, she's doing it. That means I can do it, right?
Hmm.
And feeling safe is very important, right? You're more likely to bring yourself to work if you do feel safe. But let's be real, like there are some times and instances where you don't feel safe, right?
Absolutely.
I'm curious for you, has there ever been a time where you haven't felt safe and you felt the need to hide parts of who you are?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Especially when you don't fit a traditional mold. And I go back to sort of being the eldest daughter of Latino immigrants, Hispanic immigrants. And there's always some family crisis that I'm dealing with at some point during the week. there's a WhatsApp conversation with 167 messages on my phone dealing with whatever, or there's someone who needs something figured out, or there's like fulanitos, sisters, brothers, cousins,
Fulanito.
everybody, like there's always something that's happening in that space. And I don't always want to showcase that. It's messy. And, in part, sometimes when the folks are near and dear to my heart, like I don't necessarily want the world to know their struggles and their issues with, because sometimes they're going to judge them, right? Like, why are you dealing with this? You're the daughter, they're the aunts, uncles, older generation. Like, why is this falling on you? And sometimes that can be really hard to explain.
Yeah.
So I don't always bring those pieces with me, but I do say, hey, I'm kind of dealing with some personal stuff right now. I'm gonna head out a little bit early, or I'm gonna log off for an hour, or I just need the space to deal with this in my head. Everything is fine. Nothing's going on. But I need to take care of myself because I just spent some time taking care of all of that. So, there definitely have been times earlier in my career where there was a lot of stuff happening
Mhm.
in my home life, and I felt like I had to mask. I had to put on the mask that everything was fine and okay, and it was not, right? And so like productivity was out the door, my attention span during the day was out the door, and like you try so hard just to fit yourself back in that mold. And there were definitely days when I got home and I was just exhausted from trying to hang on to that type of employee that I had to be in that moment. And I don't know, again, if it's just I'm older, like I've heard when you hit a certain age, you're just like, I don't care anymore. Like you think about things differently, or I think a lot of it has to do with the team and the culture here that I work with, that I can say like, I need a beat. I'm going to get this together and then I'll be back. And when I'm back, I'll knock it out of the park. But right now I need to recuperate.
Yeah, that resonates with me so much. On a different experience, I remember being in a meeting. So I've been in sales for most of my career, and I was in a meeting with like many teams in the organization, all rolling up to like a director, right? And it was time for questions, and our team was already on track to hitting our quota. But I asked the question, I was like, hey, there's this launch coming up, and we're struggling to get incremental revenue because of X, Y, and Z. Like, is anyone else experiencing these issues? And some people raised their hand. They were like, oh yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Like, I'm struggling with this as well. This is what I did though. I was like, oh, great tip. When I got back to my desk, I got roasted. M- my teammates were like, you can't say that in a meeting with the director. The director's gonna think that we're not on our shit. They're gonna think that we're
Mm,
slacking. Like,
mhm.
you can't you gotta consult with us before putting out that image of our team out there. I was like, oh my God, I thought one of our values, what I thought one of our team values was supposed to be vulnerable. Like, should we not ask these vulnerable questions? I was like, I'm trying to help us out, right? But it goes back to
Yeah,
this idea around like this perfect mold that we're trying to fit into. And if we do anything to go out of that, like in that moment, I was like, oh my God, like they're never gonna trust me with anything. They maybe even
right.
fire me. Like, there's so much fear
Yeah.
that comes with that because you don't know how other people are going to interpret it or react. Yeah. And now I think it is a combination of like being on a safer environment, safer team. Because I've been part of other teams where I've shared that information. They're like, oh, great question, Pavel. Thanks for
Yeah.
asking that. Or
Right.
also a combination of me being a little bit older and me being a little bit more experienced and not really caring, and me being confident to push back when they push back. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But yeah,
Mhm.
I've just want to empathize and say that I've been there
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, and like walk me through why the director shouldn't know that this is an area that we might need more conversation about, or like why can't we share this? Like what is the cultural fabric that you're wrapping yourself in that tells you like don't showcase that. You didn't say like, "Hey, how do we deal with Bob in accounting because he's a real jerk," right? Like not saying that. You're saying like, I want to do this better and I'd like to learn, I'd like to grow. How can we establish that? But yeah, I get examples like that.
Exactly. Anyway, to wrap things up, want to ask you, what's one thing that continues to empower and inspire you to be your most authentic self?
When I see people taking chances on themselves, when I see people betting on strengths, their skills, their belief in themselves, I get such joy out of that, out of knowing that there isn't one way to get to a goal. There isn't one way to sort of live this life, that you can be a creature of change, and you can do things that are scary and risky because in your heart and in your soul you know that that's a direction you want to move in. I love seeing that.
Thank you. And I'll share this with you. When I first started the podcast, I knew I was going to ask this question last, but going into it, I thought the answer was going to be something tangible. I thought
Mm,
someone was going to say, yeah, I do this, but I feel the most confident, or I'm inspired when I wear something specific. I'm inspired when I have my favorite ring on, my favorite earrings, when I do my hair a certain way. Literally every single person has said that they do it for someone else, whether it's their son, their niece, their daughter, their employees that roll up into them. Literally everyone says that they do it for someone else.
it's amazing how connected we all are.